Hello, all you freedom-loving people. A lawsuit was filed to require the Fed to hold its upcoming interest rate review meeting in public. Ghislaine Maxwell's legal team asked the House subcommittee to delay her August 11th deposition, and the trade deal with China continues. Okay, let's get into it. Yesterday, Ghislaine Maxwell appealed to the Supreme Court asking for the dismissal of her federal sex trafficking conviction. Maxwell's lawyers argued that she couldn't be prosecuted because Jeffrey Epstein's plea deal with prosecutors in 2007 included protection for his accomplices. Epstein's plea deal with federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Florida included a provision which protected potential co-conspirators from criminal charges. The deal stipulated that prosecutors in Miami would not institute any criminal charges against any potential co-conspirators of Epstein. The deal named 4 individuals, but Maxwell was not one of them. But Maxwell's lawyers argued that the deal also included their client when it said any potential co-conspirators are also immunized in the case. Maxwell's legal team wrote, "This case is about what the government promised, not what Epstein did." The new filing by Maxwell's legal team came after the Justice Department filed a motion earlier this month that the Supreme Court should not take up Maxwell's appeal case. Last week, on Thursday and Friday, Maxwell met with the DOJ and Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche to answer many questions. David Oscar Marcus, one of Maxwell's lawyers, said outside the courthouse in Florida last week that his client answered every question Blanche asked of her. Maxwell engaged in more than 9 hours of interviews with Blanche. Yesterday, Marcus also appeared to be hoping for a pardon from President Trump after Maxwell reportedly didn't hold back during questioning by the DOJ. He said, "They asked about every possible thing you could imagine, everything." Marcus claimed that Ghislaine Maxwell spoke with Blanche about 100 different people related to Epstein's case. Yesterday, Marcus also wrote on X, "We are appealing not only to the Supreme Court, but to the President himself to recognize how profoundly unjust it is to scapegoat Ghislaine Maxwell for Epstein's crimes, especially when the government promised she would not be prosecuted." On December 29, 2021, Maxwell was convicted on 5 charges related to her role in the Jeffrey Epstein case of child sex trafficking. And Maxwell is now serving a 20-year prison sentence for her crimes. Marcus also said that he had not put in a formal request with the White House for a pardon for Maxwell, but he didn't rule out taking that action in the future, saying things are happening so quickly. And yesterday, when President Trump hosted UK Prime Minister Starmer at the Trump Turnberry golf course in Scotland, reporters asked if he considered pardoning Maxwell.
Mr. President, the President completely rule out a pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell when you landed. Is that something you would ever consider, and why?
Pardon for who?
For Ghislaine Maxwell.
Well, I'm allowed to give her a pardon, but nobody's approached me with it. Nobody's asked me about it. It's in the news about that aspect of it, but right now it would be inappropriate to talk about it. So,
Mr. President, and during the meeting, President Trump also once again responded to the drawing claim by the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
Do you think that drawing, I think I heard you say something the other day, that the drawing that was the subject of the Wall Street Journal report.
I don't do drawings. I'm not a drawing person.
Do you think it was fraudulent?
I don't do drawings. Sometimes people say, would you draw a building? And I'll draw 4 lines and a little roof, for a charity stuff. But I'm not a drawing person. I don't do drawings of women, that I can tell you. They say there's a drawing of a woman, and I don't do drawings of women. And also, Epstein was always a very controversial guy. I was at a very high position, pretty much all my life. In all fairness, I've been doing this for a long time. I had the top show on television. I had the #1 bestsellers. I had everything, right? And I was a very successful business guy. He was a very controversial. Who would do a controversial drawing? Now, with that being said, they say there were many letters done by many people, and many big people, big successful people. But I just don't. When you talk about files, I just keep going back, and other people too. Even the enemy says this thing is not correct, because if we had it, we would have used it on the guy.
And President Trump was also asked why he threw Epstein out of Mar-a-Lago years ago.
As far as the time you threw him out of Mar-a-Lago, can you settle that? What was it about? What caused the breach with him?
That's such old history, very easy to explain, but I don't want to waste your time by explaining it. But for years, I wouldn't talk to Jeffrey Epstein. I wouldn't talk because he did something that was inappropriate. He hired help, and I said, don't ever do that again. He stole people that worked for me. I said, don't ever do that again. He did it again, and I threw him out of the place, persona non grata. I threw him out, and that was it. I'm glad I did, if you want to know the truth.
And today, Maxwell's legal team asked the House subcommittee to delay her August 11th deposition and to set conditions for her cooperation. Last week, her lawyers indicated that Maxwell declined to cooperate with the subpoena. But today, her lawyers noted that Maxwell now wants a compromise in order to facilitate her testimony. Her requests include immunity, advanced questions, a delay until her appeals end, and to hold the deposition outside the prison. Otherwise, the attorneys wrote, Maxwell would invoke her Fifth Amendment rights. A spokesperson for the House Oversight Committee said that the panel would soon respond to Maxwell's request, but they would not consider granting her congressional immunity. And some Republicans say that a closed-door meeting and possible immunity would only deepen Americans' distrust about the Epstein case. And today, there was an audio circulating with President Trump allegedly talking on Air Force One about how Epstein allegedly stole girls from the Mar-a-Lago spa. We're still verifying the authenticity and we'll share it tomorrow if it's confirmed. On Monday, U.S. and Chinese officials concluded the first day of the third round of trade talks in Stockholm, Sweden. The two sides held talks for more than 5 hours. A negotiating team led by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng met at the Rosenbad building, which is the seat of the Swedish government. But neither side took interviews from the media on their way out, and negotiations continue today. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer said that the trade talks with China are more focused on continued monitoring and checking in on the implementation of our agreement thus far. He said, I don't expect some kind of enormous breakthrough today. One of the chief questions looming over the talks is whether the two nations will extend their temporary pause on the sweeping tariffs. The United States and China reached a temporary truce in May and rolled back the tariffs. But the 90-day truce will expire on August 12th. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent suggested last week that an extension of such a pause was likely to come out of the trade talks. He also said that he thinks trade is in a very good place with China. Yesterday, we reported that the U.S. wants the CCP to further open up the Chinese market and buy more U.S. goods. But even if the U.S. and China reach a deal similar to President Trump's first-term Phase 1 trade agreement, in which the CCP promises to import more U.S. oil, liquefied natural gas, and other commodities, the prospects for implementation of the agreement are still uncertain. At this point, China's imports of a wide range of U.S. goods have fallen sharply or even stopped altogether in recent months, according to the latest Chinese customs data. While negotiators continue to hold talks in Sweden, President Trump has said that he may take Chinese President Xi Jinping's request to visit China. President Trump wrote on Truth Social, "The fake news is reporting that I am seeking a summit with President Xi of China. This is not correct. I am not seeking anything. I may go to China, but it would only be at the invitation of President Xi, which has been extended. Otherwise, no interest." And U.S. products that have already entered the Chinese market are facing a shrinking market. Apple has announced the closure of its Dalian store. This was the first directly operated outlet on the Chinese mainland to shut down, but Apple did not disclose the reason for the closure. Dalian is a city with a population of 7.5 million. Once the store that is located in the Parkland Shopping Center closes, only one Apple-owned store will remain in the city. The media analyzed that this was perhaps a result of slowing iPhone sales. The move coincides with Huawei Technologies regaining its lead in China's smartphone market in the second quarter of 2025. According to data released by market research firm Canalys, Huawei captured 18% of the smartphone market in China between April and June, and Apple ranked 5th in the market with a market share of only 15%. But the Chinese public thinks that it was about the location of the store. Dalian Parkland Shopping Center was positioned as a high-end shopping mall, but then it began to decline a decade ago, and it is now a low-end shopping mall that no one cares about. Others think it shows a change in Apple's strategy toward the Chinese market. With the first one closing down, the next one will follow soon. Apple can't compete with Huawei in the Chinese market, not because the quality of its product is inferior to Huawei's, but because Huawei's prices are more attractive to the Chinese public. The iPhone 16 Pro with 512 gigabytes sells for 11,000 yuan in China, which is roughly $1,500. And Huawei's equivalent, the Mate 70 Pro with 512 gigabytes, costs around $975. And Apple phones aren't the only foreign product being beaten by price. Haagen-Dazs ice cream is another example. Recently, there has been news that General Mills, a leading U.S. food company, is considering selling the store business of its ice cream brand Haagen-Dazs in mainland China. Although General Mills responded no comment to the rumors of the sale, it is an indisputable fact that Haagen-Dazs' growth in the Chinese market has been weak. Haagen-Dazs has become synonymous with petite bourgeoisie and romance since it entered China in 1996, capturing countless consumers with its high-end positioning and emotional marketing. However, in 2025, Haagen-Dazs was in deep trouble. Revenue in China fell 3.2% year-on-year in the third quarter of 2025. Consumer downgrading, a central trend in the economic downturn, has been the most significant cause of Haagen-Dazs' decline in the Chinese market. For the infinite glory to being abandoned by the market, the story of Haagen-Dazs in China for 29 years reflects the profound change of the Chinese consumer market from ostentatious consumption to pragmatic consumption. In 1996, Haagen-Dazs opened its first store in China in Shanghai. It cost about 4 cents or 25 yuan for a bowl of ice cream, but this was still an exorbitant price in China at the time when the average monthly salary was only $100 or 700 yuan. With the selection of imported raw materials, exquisite store decoration, and love her, take her to eat Haagen-Dazs emotional marketing, Haagen-Dazs quickly locked in white-collar workers of foreign companies and young couples, and they created a high-end image. This marketing strategy accurately hit the psychology of China's pre-consumer society in the 1990s. High price means high quality, and consumption is a status symbol. Between 2006 and 2015, Haagen-Dazs' sales in China grew at an average annual rate of 23%, and from 2017 to 2019, Haagen-Dazs' growth in China reached its peak. Stores were located in first and second tier cities, contributing nearly 50% to global sales. Then, starting in 2020, Haagen-Dazs' dream began to fall apart due to the onslaught of the COVID outbreak. Haagen-Dazs revenues began to decline steadily. Revenue fell to $718 million in 2020. It then fell way down to $138 million in the third quarter of 2025. Store traffic was in double-digit decline, and the number of stores plummeted to 263 from 557 in 2019. Of course, the decline of Haagen-Dazs in the Chinese market is not due to a single factor. It was the result of multiple crises, such as the appearance of the information gap, the intensification of competition, high operating costs, the downgrading of consumption, and the impact of the pandemic. But consumer downgrading was the central driver that pushed Haagen-Dazs' high-end model to the margins of the market. Consumer downgrading refers to consumers being forced by economic pressures to reduce spending on non-essentials, to shift to lower-priced, more cost-effective products and services, and to stop paying for brand premiums or emotional value. In China, the downgrading of consumption is a visual representation of the economic downturn. This is very evident in the data of 2025. The PPI fell 3.6% year-on-year in June. This was the 33rd consecutive month of negative growth and the largest decline since July 2023, indicating intensifying deflationary pressures. The 2024 Consumer Survey reports that 80% of consumers are in a spending downgrade dilemma, 59% are spending less due to falling incomes, and 42% explicitly say that they are spending less for the year. We've mentioned some of the reasons for the decrease in disposable income of Chinese residents, such as there has been a wave of closures of small and medium-sized enterprises, and the employment prospects of people from years ago are uncertain. The depreciation of real estate is also a major cause. Real estate is the main source of property income for Chinese residents. Since the 1990s, real estate in China had been on an upward trend. As a result, Chinese people regarded real estate as an investment that never loses money, and all of them tended to invest their life savings in real estate. There are even a number of people who borrowed from loan sharks to invest in real estate. This crazy thinking drove up the bubble in China's real estate industry. Real estate developers dared to build more houses than the number of families in China because they would always sell. At the height of the madness, Chinese real estate developers didn't even need to build apartments or houses to sell them. They just needed to design them and set up a sales office to start selling them. The biggest exaggeration is that once a buyer signs on the dotted line, not only does he have to make a down payment, but he immediately starts paying a mortgage. He's paying a mortgage for the house that's on a drawing board. The clients who are paying for a house on a drawing board should be the fondest dream that every real estate developer can have. That's why Chinese businessmen were frantically buying up land and sketching designs. Western investment companies were also joining in the recklessness. But no one saw the bubble growing bigger and bigger. Finally, the 2020 pandemic stuck a needle in this giant bubble. During the 3 years of the pandemic, the Chinese government banned all non-essential business activities, including housing construction. So construction workers had no income and suppliers of business materials had no orders. At first, the expectation was that lifting the lockdown would lead to a spending spree with a vengeance. So they thought everyone would be spending their savings or taking on debt. But the revenge spending spree never materialized. After the lifting of the lockdown, it was realized that almost everyone's income had been lowered. Many restaurants disappeared and hotels closed down, and now more and more houses are being foreclosed on by banks because people can't pay their mortgages. Houses are starting to come down in price. And the most normal economic phenomenon in a normal economy is that house prices go up and down. But this was like a shocking revelation to the Chinese people. Since the first few decades of the Chinese Communist Party's seizure of power, houses in China had been a government-controlled commodity. They were allocated to the residents according to the government's preferences. It was only at the end of the last century, after the start of the communist reforms, that houses became a commodity that residents could freely buy with money. But in the years since then, they've only seen house prices skyrocket. The influence of people under 40 is synonymous with houses going up in value like crazy. All of their financial investment plans are based on this philosophy, and a drop in the price of a house means that the bedrock of their financial system is shaken. This has had a far greater impact on China as a society than we can imagine. The CCP government also understands the gravity of the situation. On the one hand, they know that China's real estate is like a tumor that has absorbed almost all of the spendable money in the hands of the people. But on the other hand, they dare not let this bubble burst easily. So they have repeatedly introduced various policies to try and make the bubble last a little longer. But a bubble is a bubble. It's a bubble that will burst no matter how careful people are. The sales area of new commercial properties nationwide in January to June of 2025 fell 40% from 2019, and home prices fell to half in most cities. And residents' household wealth has shrunk. So tightening the purse strings has become the norm. The culture of competing for poverty is prevalent on social media platforms. Young white-collar workers share their low-cost lifestyles, such as where to find cheap lunch specials and how to make a great dinner on a low budget. So, in this environment, the decline of Häagen-Dazs is not an isolated case. China's local high-end ice cream brands are also facing difficulties, and Apple, Tesla, and international brands of luxury goods face the same dilemma. The Fed is the central bank of the United States. It is in charge of U.S. monetary policy, including printing money and short-term interest rates. That prerogative is now being challenged. Azoria Capital filed a lawsuit last week arguing that the central bank's decades-long practice of holding Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC, meetings behind closed doors violates the Sunshine Government Act, which generally requires multi-member agencies to allow the public to attend their meetings. Azoria Capital asked the court to issue an emergency order requiring the Fed to hold its upcoming interest rate review meeting in public. But the request was rejected by U.S. District Judge Burl A. Howell on Monday. Howell said that the Sunshine Act does not apply to the FOMC and concluded Azoria was unlikely to prevail on the merits. After the ruling, Azoria Capital CEO James Fishback issued a statement that Azoria would continue pressing its case. Azoria Capital's attitude reflects the worship of freedom that is ingrained in the bones of Americans. They do not believe in all governments, including all institutions that hold centralized power. One might think that every country should have a central bank, but Americans didn't share that idea for more than 100 years after the founding of the country. So for 100 years or so, the United States did not have a central bank. And as we know, the Federal Reserve is responsible for printing money. You can see the words Federal Reserve Note on the US dollar bill, which means it's a note issued by the Federal Reserve, in essence, money. So before the establishment of a central bank, who printed the money in the United States? The answer may surprise you. Anyone could print money. In the 19th century, many banks could issue their own notes. However, for money to circulate, it had to be backed by collateral, gold, silver, or federal government bonds. And this is very similar to how banks will soon be issuing stable coins that are backed one-to-one with dollars or treasury bonds. This approach works under normal circumstances. However, in extraordinary circumstances such as war, it can be unsuccessful. Yet Americans remain unwilling to compromise. Twice in those 100 years, the United States set up temporary central banks. The first and second banks of the United States were to solve the problem of debt caused by war. But each time the temporary central banks only lasted for 20 years. They all ended after 20 years. Before the establishment of the Federal Reserve, the United States experienced a financial crisis every 15 years on average. During each crisis, people rushed to banks to exchange money, ultimately forcing financial institutions to halt operations, and this triggered a long-term economic recession. The most severe such financial crisis occurred in 1907. This was the first global financial crisis. As the only major country without a central bank, the U.S. government ultimately turned to private banker J.P. Morgan, who used his personal wealth and prestige to convince Congress. At this point, the U.S. government were persuaded that they had the need to reform the financial system and establish a central bank. The bank said that this would at least provide a buffer against commercial bank runs. The private consortium of bankers then began drafting the Federal Reserve Act, and the Federal Reserve was officially established in 1913. Okay, we'll continue our breakdown of the Fed and the White House tomorrow. And that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you so much for your support of Front Page. Please remember to leave a comment below the video. This is really helping us to be seen all around the world. The more people who watch Front Page, the more freedom-loving people the world will have. And please hit the like button and hit the notification bell after subscribing. And please share this video with your friends and family because everybody deserves to know the truth.